to chair the first session, I'd like to introduce somebody who has campaigned on equality and women's issues for many years. And most importantly, she is a cyclist and cycled here today. So I'd like to hand over to Senator Ivana Bacik to chair the first session.
Thanks very much, Ciaran, and thank you to the Dublin Cycling Campaign for inviting me to chair the session this morning. I'm delighted to do it, and also delighted to hear the Minister's announcements of various initiatives for cyclists. And I think you did well not to dwell on the bad behaviour issue, which is always a bit of a sore point, because as I always think as a very committed daily cyclist, when the infrastructure is in place for cyclists to be able to cycle safely in Dublin on every road, then that would be great. But there's certainly plenty of roads where there is just no room for cyclists. And I know it's a real, I don't like cycling on footpaths any more than any other cyclist, but I think it's just, there is a real problem that Dublin is built for motorists primarily, and there's still very little in terms of safe infrastructure for cyclists. And anyone who cycles regularly around Stephen's Green will know what I mean in terms of the linking up of cycle routes. It's certainly improved greatly, and credit to those who are responsible for that in Dublin City Council, but there's still a lot to be done. I was just particularly interested in a conference that was focusing on gender in cycling. Ciaran has already said that only about 1 in 4 cyclists in Dublin are women, and that's not unique to Dublin or indeed to Ireland, because if one looks at the international experience, you see that there is a gender gap in cycling around the world. In Washington DC in just last year, the Cycling Forum calculated that only about 2,000, nearly 3,000 out of nearly 10,000 cyclists there were women, and the perceived risk was a big factor in putting women off cycling, that women would tend to be more risk averse. I'll again make no comment about the broader implications of that finding, but they found that the way to encourage more women to cycle was to build safer cycling infrastructure, but also to ensure greater visibility of social networks and role models to encourage women to cycle. So just before I introduce our first speaker, I just wanted to say that, that clearly these are issues not just for women cyclists, but these are issues that would encourage everybody to cycle more if there was a safer cycling infrastructure, and indeed if there were better social networks around cycling. And I know those are some of the issues that will be explored today. And I thought just in a small way in Leinster House, I would try to improve the issue of social networks by encouraging other members of the Oireachtas to cycle daily. And I've set up just yesterday an all-party Oireachtas cyclists group, and I'm glad to say that I've already had quite a number of TDs, no other senators as yet, who have signed up and who are willing to get on their bikes, literally. I'm hoping the Minister will also do that, and not just on Sunday, but coming into Leinster House on the bikes. I do think that's important in terms of just public perception too. So that's just one small contribution to National Bike Week. Could I now introduce our first speaker this morning in this morning's session, Ciaran Cuffe, who of course is no stranger to anyone here, who's an architect and planner and lectures in spatial planning in Dublin Institute of Technology in the School of Spatial Planning, but in a previous life was Green Minister for State with responsibility for sustainable transport and planning, and responsible for some of the initiatives that Minister Varadkar has spoken about. And of course he's also cycled through the Alps, Rockies, Pyrenees and the streets of Dublin, and I've seen him cycling through the streets of Dublin many times. So Ciaran Cuffe.
Thanks very much, Ivana. Minister, good morning. The first thing I'd like to do this morning is express my solidarity with anyone else in the room who has wet socks. I think the mark of an all-weather cyclist, the mark of the really good all-weather cyclist is that they have the gear to avoid the wet socks. But for those of us in the middle ground, that squelchy feeling on a morning like this is part of what we do. I guess what I want to talk about today is how can we take cycling from being a bolt-on strategy into being at the heart of our transport policies. Also, how do we make the money available? And how do we change the law to really make it easier for the cyclist on the streets of Dublin and elsewhere? I love my city, and I've watched it change in the 30 years that I've cycled on its streets. And sometimes it's changed for the better, sometimes for the worse. But what's important for me is that the city, its buildings, its people and its places endure. How we experience the city is crucial, whether we live here, work here, or come here on holidays. And that experience is shaped by the way we make, manage and modify the built environment. And I'm not convinced that those in authority have the understanding, the experience, or the passion to make Dublin a great cycling city. I started off campaigning in the 1990s, and along with people in the Dublin Cycling Campaign, like Ciaran Byrne from Square Wheel Bikes, we used guerrilla-like tactics back then to paint cycle lanes on O'Connell Street before the Gardaí intervened. Attitudes were different back then, but there was a real sense of being a very distinct minority who found it almost impossible to get our voice heard. I remember when the then Mayor of Dublin was opening a multi-storey car park at the back of the Mansion House, I stepped forward and presented him with the bicycle. He didn't know what to do, and the senior officials were left shuffling quite uncomfortably. But really we wanted to make the point that we needed to have a decent budget and a decent commitment to cycling at that time. Around about the same time in 1996, I proposed and put out on the streets of Dublin half a dozen white bicycles as a prelude to the Dublin bike scheme, essentially a free bicycle scheme. And those bikes were occasionally sighted for several months actually around the city of Dublin. But when we approached the then Dublin Transportation Office seeking funding, our proposals were rebuffed. So I think the time those in power simply weren't open to the suggestion of putting cycling at the heart of transport policy. However, around at that time as well, my colleague John Gormley was Lord Mayor and set up a Lord Mayor's Commission on Cycling. And I think that report advocated high quality provision of cycling facilities, and I think really did an awful lot to kickstart the change of thinking within local authorities and elsewhere. Today, the news for cycling is fairly mixed. I mean, I think we have had some significant progress. There's been a downward trend in road deaths and injuries for cyclists. The Dublin Bike Scheme has been an extraordinary success. The Cycle to Work tax relief scheme introduced by the last government has got an awful lot of people who wouldn't think about cycling on their bikes, or at least they have the bike sitting there staring at them when they wake up in the morning, and some of those are using the bike to cycle to and from work. And also bikes can now be taken off-peak on commuter trains, and also on mainline trains can be booked onto those. So these are steps of progress in the right direction. But there are also real concerns out there. From the last full travel survey, we know that less than 2% of workers commuted by bike in Ireland, and that was down from 6% 20 years previously. So a threefold drop in the space of 20 years. Currently, cycling receives only the crumbs of the overall transport budget, and I have a few figures on that later on. Dublin City Council has lost its full-time cycling officer, and there's no indication that the post will be filled. The target set out in Smarter Travel of 10% of journeys being by bike by 2020 won't be realised unless profound changes emerge in attitudes and funding from those in power. Finally, our urban roads are racetracks where most cars are speeding, and that's from the Road Safety Authority's statistics. Most cars are speeding, in other words, breaking the speed limit, and the law is simply not enforced. And it's no wonder against this backdrop that the typical cyclist in this dangerous and aggressive world is a young adult male. The young, the elderly and the female cyclist are taking their lives into their hands in venturing out into this war zone where only the strong or the well-protected survive. There is no absence of policies that promote cycling. However, there are enormous obstacles to their implementation. Changes are required in the attitude to cycling, the financing and the legal framework around how we treat vulnerable road users. The DTI's final report in 1995 was one of the first national policies that clearly aimed to encourage people to walk, cycle and use public transport. However, much of the funding was spent on road proposals that increased suburban sprawl and increased journey times. The DTO did produce a national manual for the provision of cycling facilities in urban areas in 1998, and that at least gave local authority engineers some useful information on how to design and build cycle facilities. A platform for change from the DTO in 2001 introduced the principle of demand management to reduce the growth in travel through the application of land use and other policies, and which is designed to encourage a transfer of trips, especially at peak periods, from the car to sustainable modes of transport. Transport 21 came out in 2005, and it included a lot of big ticket items: the motorways, Metro North, Metro West, the Dart interconnector. Cycling didn't figure prominently in that document. And the National Roads Authority produced guidelines on traffic calming for towns and villages in 2005 as well. But it did suggest that cyclists can safely share facilities with other vehicles, provided that operating speeds have been reduced to below 60 kilometres an hour. And personally, I think that's rather over-optimistic. I think for a cyclist to share the road with someone driving at 60 kilometres an hour, we know the stats for if the two of them come in contact. It simply is a dangerous and intimidating place. And if we want to increase participation, we have to reduce the level of intimidation on the roads. Smarter Travel stated that the real challenge is to change mindsets. This came out in 2009, so that our institutions and individual citizens realised the benefits from altering their travel behaviour. And it also acknowledged, I think for the first time, that transport and travel trends in Ireland are unsustainable, and transport emissions are continuing to grow. And if we don't do something about this, both economic competitiveness and quality of life will decline. And it said we needed more imaginative proposals relating to cycling and walking. And a key issue to be addressed is a new approach to the allocation of road space, giving priority to more sustainable forms of transport. So these are all good policies. And we also had a national cycle planning policy framework published in the same year, saying that we can look forward to 10% of all trips being made by bike by 2020. We then last year had the National Cycle Manual, and we also have a Greater Dublin Area draft transport strategy. And it proposes reductions in traffic speeds in town centres. It says we need more direct routes for cyclists, we need more contraflows on one-way streets, and we need pedestrian and cycle-only links. And it also said cycling education and training need to become part of the school curriculum and facilitate cycle training for school children and for adults as well. Again, these ambitious targets for 10% by 2020, that's simply not going to happen unless there is a change of culture in both government and in our local authorities. The current figure, at less than 2% at national level, compares to 26% in the Netherlands and 18% in Denmark. We need a radical change to achieve this. I mean, there is no shortage of good plans and oh yeah, this sign. I came across this. It's actually in the official guidelines for road signs, and it indicates slippery roads for cyclists. And I thought, in my mind, it kind of sums up the real challenge that we have out there. It's a fairly slippery world, and if we want to increase cycling numbers, we have to really confront this dilemma. And often the information isn't out there. There are confused and mixed messages that are coming out to the general public. We need to challenge that. We need to make sure that everybody from the top to the bottom is promoting and encouraging cycling. But we do have some good policies out there. We do, in recent years, certainly, I think, set the right tone for what needs to happen in the years ahead. There's just an overview of the modal share. If we want to get from the second last figure there to the figure at the bottom, it is a huge, big ask, and I'm not convinced that it's going to happen overnight. Just while we're on the issue of policy, the Road Safety Authority adopts an attitude towards cycling that I believe is a little bit contradictory. It informs us that cycling is healthy, good for the environment, but then it immediately stresses the safety and vulnerability of cyclists in every second sentence. And the repeated emphasis on high visibility clothing and reflective stripes appears to cast the vulnerable road user as the offender who needs to stand out, rather than focusing on slowing down drivers. Partnerships with the producers of high visibility products like 3M, which sponsor part of their website, should be carefully considered and evaluated. Perhaps the vehicles should also be covered in high visibility tape. Also, the Road Safety Authority's most recent figures for speeding suggest that 78% of drivers are exceeding the 50-kilometre speed limit on urban national roads. So the campaign needs to focus a lot more on vehicle driver behaviour. And according to the RSA's own figures, over 40% of cyclist fatalities occur in urban areas, and 85% of cyclistic injuries occur there. So let's make sure that the speed limits are enforced. The Garda Síochána is working hard to improve safety on our roads, but we must ensure that it sets a good example in its own behaviour. And repeated parking in bike lanes sends out all the wrong messages to cyclists. In their own traffic plan, they rightly focus on outcomes such as reducing fatal and serious injuries, but they also appear to give equal weighting to the significant contribution to the free flow of traffic. And this could be read as being at odds with the NTA's 2030 vision of slowing down traffic where necessary in urban areas. And there is research going back to Kenworthy and Newman from 20-30 years ago suggesting that free-flowing traffic may not reduce fuel consumption or air pollution. If we make it easier for cars to get around, we probably will be making it more difficult for cyclists. And there is this contradiction that needs to be addressed. I want to touch briefly on the issue of energy and emissions. And very often it's suggested that the cyclist is the no-emission vehicle. But actually research from the UK suggests that there is a fairly significant contribution compared to the car. 21 grams per kilometre compared to a passenger car at 270 grams. That seems like a little bit odd as a little bit high as emissions go. But what these figures are taking into account that if you replicate the cyclist journeys, which are typically short and in stop-start traffic, a car in equivalent conditions will have quite high emissions compared to the kind of figures you see in the small print underneath the ad. That information is out there on the web. And interestingly, electric bikes fare very well in this, because we use an awful lot of food energy in making the wheels of a bike go round, and that's quite a contributor to that 21 grams figure. As well as that, there is the cost of the carbon cost of the steel and the energy that goes into making the bike in the first place. But I thought it was interesting just to have a slight reality check that there are emissions from cars and we need to think about that. One of the funny things about the emissions side of things is it depends a huge amount on the kind of diet you have. So if you stick to a vegetarian diet, your emissions will be really low. But if you're eating steak every day and cycling a bike, it may well be that your emissions will be much higher than the vegetarians driving low emissions cars. It's a slight aside, but I think on a scientific basis we need to just be a little bit careful on how we talk about bikes being the ultimate zero emission vehicle. The future expansion of cycling is being significantly affected by budgetary constraints. You can see the figures there on the screen. At the moment we're spending about more or less £1 billion a year in total, and I do welcome the investment programme for cycle routes announced by Minister of State Kelly last week, 7 million over what appears to be a 2-year period. It represents less than 1/3 of 1% of the transport budget. And with these figures, it's going to be extremely challenging to reach the 10% of journeys by bike by 2020. And we do have 239 million allocated to smarter travel to the NTA in the Greater Dublin area. But look at what that money is travelling. I've highlighted the cycling stuff in red, or the main cycling stuff in red. And really, I think it's very clear that cycling will only receive the crumbs of the transport cake. And that has to change. Funding and commitment to local authority cycling officers is also required. And the National Cycle Planning Policy Framework says each local authority should assign an officer at an appropriate senior level as cycling officer responsible for overseeing the formulation and delivery of the local cycling policy. And this needs to be embedded within the wider transportation policies. We've lost our cycling officer in Dublin, and next Monday, when Mayor Montague ends his term of office, we'll have lost an advocate for cycling at the highest level in the city. I certainly compliment the great work that Andrew has done in his year in office. But I believe that a cycling officer post is too important to be filled, if it is filled, on rolling 6-month contracts. And Minister Hogan must commit to filling this post in a manner that will build on the great work carried out by Ciaran Fallon and his colleagues in Dublin City Council. I want to go on and talk a little bit about design issues. And we've got to get the design right. And Dublin won't become a world-class cycling city on its own. And we need a radical redesign of the city to put the needs of cyclists ahead of car drivers. The Green Party has published a plan showing how this might be achieved. It needs to happen at the regional level, with the S2S cycle route around the bay, the canal routes being used to help people get out to the northwest and southwest of the city as well. But we need to concentrate a huge amount of our attention to the centre of Dublin, where there is some encouraging news. We need the big picture stuff. We need to use those routes. We need to use green infrastructure. But I think there's other ways of encouraging cycling. I'd like to see a car-free day on the Liffey Quays, maybe the first Sunday of every month. It happens in other cities. It happens in Bogota. It happens in Liège in Belgium. Let's just, for one afternoon or one morning a month, allow cyclists to have the free rein of some of our busier streets. And I think that could bring on the hearts and minds issues on all of this. But we've also got to get the design right at a more detailed level. How about putting something like this cycle park up at Euston Station? I think that would get more people onto trains and transferring from train to bike. In the Netherlands, almost half the train journeys start or end with a bike journey. That only happens when you have the infrastructure. I'm not suggesting we need something like this floating in the River Liffey at Euston, but maybe some better cycling in a better position at Connolly and Euston would help us get there a lot more quickly. We need to concentrate on the micro level, at the level of individual streets as well. That's just a rough idea of where we need to widen footpaths. And if you look in detail at that, we give an enormous amount of space to the car, and it's no wonder that we get a huge amount of speeding in our urban areas. That's Parnell Square in the middle of Dublin, and the yellow is a suggestion that we simply calm down the traffic on those streets and get away from the racetracks. That's the kind of corner of Parnell Square. It's no wonder that once people come past the lights at the top right of the photograph, they simply accelerate until they're going at 50, 60, 70, 80 kilometres an hour by the time they get to that corner. And that kind of behaviour has consequences. That getting rid of these wide sweeping corners that encourage speeding, they won't save the life of 16-year-old Adam Moran, who lost his life on Parnell Square in 2008, but it may make the city a more attractive and safer place for other children and their families. So we need to get these junctions right, and we need to retrofit so many of these junctions. Have a look at what Copenhagen does with a busy traffic junction. Every bit of detail there makes the pedestrian and cyclist, it puts them at the heart of the transport equation. The cobbles on the roundabout, the benches overlooking it, the planting, the footpath at the centre of the roundabout. Cars know that they have to calm down when they come into a junction like that. We don't quite know how to do that in Dublin. We've a few good examples. There's a shot of the campfires on the Liffey Quays, and that is a step in the right direction. But, engineers need retraining. They need continued professional development to be on top of the changes in traffic engineering that are required. And it also requires the skill and the input of architects, urban designers, spatial planners, and the communities who can benefit from these changes. A manual for streets is required that illustrates best practice in managing the space between buildings. I initiated work on the Manual of Streets while in government, and its publication is long overdue. Look what can happen if you simply take away the traffic. That's on St. Patrick's Day a couple of years ago, but I think we need to consider these kind of measures on a more regular basis. I want to talk a little bit about the law. The law, one of the greatest obstacles to improving road safety is insufficient enforcement of the law, particularly around the area of parking and speeding. The first commissioner of An Garda Síochána said the force will succeed not by force of arms or numbers, but by their moral authority as the servants of the people. And An Garda Síochána must reprioritise cycle safety by taking the lead with its own actions. Over the last few years, I've collected a series of photographs of Garda vehicles not waiting for the lights to change, but stopping to take that important call, heading in for a coffee. You get the picture. All of these are cycle lanes. You can even see the guard inside the coffee shop. Maybe there's been some dramatic hold-up in Declan's sandwich bar. But I suspect with these pics, it's more about convenience. It's about bad design as well. Why didn't the City Council provide a lay-by at this location? But we do need to have leadership at the top, and that needs to start with An Garda Síochána. We need a few practical initiatives as well. The Bike Week Garda press statement places an undue focus again on the high-vis jackets, the safety gear, and obeying traffic regulations rather than encouraging one of the most sustainable means of traffic. The focus in Bike Week should be on car drivers who break the speed limit and threaten the lives of cyclists. Another practical initiative would be to set up a national stolen bikes register. Some great work going on. The Bridewell has a register, but it's only covering the immediate area. There needs to be a national stolen bikes register, and I think that would get to the heart of bike crime. There needs to be a change of culture, but there also needs to be a change of the law. Drivers should be made automatically liable for accidents involving child cyclists. This would ensure that cars slowed down in the presence of children. That's the way the law works in Germany, the Netherlands, and it's what we need here to ensure that cars slow down sufficiently in the presence of children on the roads. Strict liability rules apply in those countries where pedestrian cyclist casualty rates are much lower than in these islands. These rules encourage road users to adopt a duty of care to others, and this would encourage children to cycle. It would encourage parents to allow their children out on the roads and make roads safer. We also need to rethink around the issue of speed limits. In Copenhagen, there's a speed limit of 40 kilometres an hour widely used in urban areas that aren't residential streets. That could be introduced in Dublin and might avoid some of the controversy in certain areas where the 30 kilometre an hour speed limit has been introduced. So there are some areas where 40 kilometre should be part of the law. But there's also streets where we need to bring it down to 20 kilometres per hour. And a speed limit of 20 kilometres as well as 40 should also be on the statute books. That's a shot from the United States, where there's speed limits of 15 miles an hour, which is 24 kilometres per hour outside schools. So we need to go lower in certain areas. That's an impromptu sign, I think, written by kids in a cul-de-sac in Dunleary. We need to put this kind of approach into the law if we want to make it happen. I'm not sure if we need to go this far, as Dublin City Council showed, but we certainly need some of this. So, how am I doing for time? I'll go as quickly as possible. Let me talk about the vision thing for a minute. I think establishing a vision can be the most difficult part of the equation. And I believe that vision must come from the top. And I applaud the work undertaken by those in power to lead on this issue, but much work remains. There is still a car culture in evidence within Dublin City Council and the Department of Transport. When employees have the right to drive to work and park for free in the buildings that they're employed in, it can be difficult to increase cycling numbers. When mileage rates are generous and based on engine size, it's no wonder that such a culture persists. There are some good signs as to what's happening out there, and these are just a few shots of the streets in Dublin. But I find this interesting, the kind of no bikes allowed sign. And again, a bit like the Garda vehicles parked in bike lanes, I have a collection of these as well. And one of the first things I did on becoming Minister of State in the Department of Transport for a very brief period was take out my spanner to the sign on the railings outside the Department of Transport. So I took it... I took it upon myself to try and somehow change the attitude that's out there. But have a look for a moment at how two different cities approach the management of transportation. This is the live drive Twitter stream from Dublin City Council. And if you kind of read it, you can feel the tension rise in your shoulders. And it's all about where there's blockages and where there's a free road. The live drive Twitter stream from Dublin City Council, I love the way it occasionally says, you have a clear run all the way from Blanchardstown to the M50. I mean, essentially, it's an invitation to put the foot down. And if you look at the picture behind that Twitter stream, it's all about speed and the open road. That culture has to change. And that isn't as easy, maybe, as a lot of the other issues are to change. The road safety plan, again, it's about the movement of traffic through College Green. Let's slow down for a minute and realise, and that's just a picture I've put in there, of a mother holding her kids' hands in College Green. Let's get away from the traffic for a minute and think about the people that are using these magnificent spaces like College Green in the heart of Dublin. Have a look at the traffic safety plan. That's the road safety plan for Dublin. Let's just nip over to Copenhagen. That's their traffic safety plan. It's not a cycling safety plan, it's a traffic safety plan. Cyclists are at the heart of how they go about all of this. The photographs that they use, they're not wearing high-vis vests, they're wearing everyday clothing. And look at that, an older woman walking across a street, not at a pedestrian crossing, not where they're instructed to go. I spoke to somebody recently and they said that their mother doesn't come into town anymore because the green man isn't long enough to get across the street. In Copenhagen, they actually show this photograph to illustrate that's who we need to consider the needs of. Again, the pictures of kids, they're not wearing 3M tape on their from their skull to their toes. They're wearing ordinary clothes. The driver has to take the responsibility to get rid of some of the danger. Again, finally, this is the website of the City Council dealing with transport. It's all about climate and environment, green urban mobility, the childcare, cyclists. The picture of the cyclist is the band across the top. You come to Dublin, it's all about traffic in Dublin, parking in Dublin, motor tax, traffic cameras, roads and traffic, driving licensing, parking control bylaws. Unless we change the homepage of the traffic department to put cycling at the heart of this, we're simply bolting cycling onto something else. There is a great website all about cycling that the City Council hosts, but we only see a tiny trace of it there on the far right. So that does have to change. There's a sign from Bike Week a couple of years ago. Expect traffic delays. Again, a bit like the bike sign. I just went out and said, look, that's what we get from Bike Week. So I think I'm well past my time. I'll finish up and say, I'd urge those in a senior position to take a trip to the Netherlands, Germany or Denmark. See the improvement in quality of life that can occur when the needs of cyclists are truly prioritised. We need more senior staff living in the heart of the cities that they manage and change. Cycling deserves to be more than an add-on strategy. It deserves a greater share of the budget and better protection in the law. And there's a marked contrast in the imagery of Denmark and Dublin. I'd like to end with a quote from Ivana Bacik, the transportation mayor of Copenhagen. And she said, look, cycling is not a goal in itself, but it's a highly prioritised political tool for creating a more livable city. You can see that when you close off a street like Fade Street for a day. People talk, they meet each other, they socialise. We need more of that. And certainly, if we are to increase the amount of women cycling, if we're to encourage more women cycling, we need to put the cyclist at the heart of our transport solutions. Cycling democratises, invigorates and transforms the city. It's a form of cultural expression and social capital that's good for your health, for the economy and the environment. Let's put cyclists first. Thank you.